The first thing I tell my clients is, are you accepting that you are getting probabilistic answers for this type of system? Oh no, absolutely not. Well, then you cannot use Gen AI for this.
Hi, welcome to AI Confidential, a show about AI and how to benefit from it responsibly. I'm Aaron Fulkerson, the CEO of Opaque.
And I'm Mark Hinkle, the publisher of the Artificially Intelligent Enterprise.
Great to have you here, Mark. It's good to see you as always.
Good to see you too.
Today we're talking with John Willis. What you talking about, Willis? John's a leading AI strategy consultant for the enterprise. He's also a tech entrepreneur and an author. I've known of John Willis for 15 years, but you've been a close friend with John for how long, Mark?
Probably since close to 20. He, at the time that I met him, he was sort of coming out of, he was a lead, like the top IBM Tivoli trainer in the world. Like he was coming out of that very enterprisey space, and he had started out working on a new business, and he was commenting on everybody's blog back when we were allowed to comment on blogs, and we got to know each other. And we've done a lot of stuff over the years. He's went from big enterprisey guy to startup guy, and I hooked him into sort of open source, and then he was one of the first 5 guys that started DevOps, and he introduced me to that whole movement. And we've collaborated over the years. He's a good guy. He's sort of like my older brother. He's about 10 years older than me, and I just pick at him, and he gives me noogies, and it all works out.
So the reason why we're really interested in talking to John is he's publishing his book. He has published his book. Okay, so The Rebels of Reason, and it's the history of AI told through the stories of lesser known technologists who really built the foundation for modern day AI. We should call this section AI in Context, AI Tangle. I say AI Tangle for a very specific reason, Mark, which is your newsletter, AI Tangle, does a fantastic 7 quick hits. Is it always 7? It's always 7, right? Or is it just quick hits?
Okay. Yeah, 7 quick hits.
Yeah. So aitangle.com, Mark's newsletter. This is where I always go to look at what's going on up to date in AI. But what's your AI? What's your quick hit or AI Tangle or AI in Context? Pew, pew, pew.
Boo, boo, boo. This week, actually, the thing that's interesting to me is it's such boring stuff, but data centers. Back in the mid 90s, when I first got into IT, we used to, it was pre-cloud, so we racked a lot of data centers, and everybody was going nuts for data center space. And the hardware compared to today was archaic. I mean, if you had 8 megabytes of RAM in your server, you were doing well. But now I'm looking at all these AI data centers, and everybody is worried about GPUs, and NVIDIA's in the news. I mean, NVIDIA blew out their number the other week by, I want to say 700 million for a quarter, which was like the 3rd largest overshot of a analyst expectations ever. So we're thinking about GPUs, but then you start thinking about the infrastructure around it. And, CoreWeave was in the news because they were the NVIDIA-backed AI data center that's like went public and tanked. And now in the last 2 months, I think they're up like 50%. So I think the thing is that we probably underestimate how important this data center thing is, not just from the GPUs, but the power and just space. Do you run into a lot of people that are doing their own data centers, or are they all cloudy?
No, I like the summit. If you look at all of the attendees at the summit, who are a lot of the sponsors, it's Meta, it's Microsoft, Google, they're all doing their own data centers, obviously. NVIDIA is a sponsor, Accenture is doing their own data centers, and they're also building on other people's. So yes, they're all doing that. And then you look at like Together AI. I don't know if you track Together AI, but they're like a hyperscaler for GPUs, right? I should say AI accelerators, because it's not just GPUs. And they've just been on a tear. Together AI. One of our investors, Chris Ray, Stanford AI Lab Factory. Whenever I speak with him, it's amazing hearing just how incredible Together AI is on a tear about helping people solve this problem of like how do you scale out. And then obviously everybody talks about energy consumption, water consumption as a second order consequence, or I guess a positive or negative externality of these data center build outs. It's a very interesting area. I'm not an expert on it, I just know that I see the headlines, and I talk to people about the just explosive growth in their infrastructure businesses building out these data centers.
Yeah. After the GPUs and the water, the other thing is power. And so I've run into, so I live, in outside the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, and we have a lot of tech here, biotech, infotech, and they're building data centers. But the problem is you got to bring a lot of power there. And it's not like you're going to have those sort of blackouts or power failures as much as you're sending a lot of power to a very concentrated place, and it causes almost, and I'm not an expert on this either, but I guess it's like interference on the lines. So you're going to have blips in your power all day long if you're in a very trafficked area, if they don't have modern infrastructure. So it's one thing to do it in like a developed growing area like where I live in, but where I grew up and you grew up in Minnesota, like that infrastructure is old. Like the power lines are still above ground on telephone poles, and that makes, that just dates the age of the infrastructure. Now all of a sudden we have basically, instead of drinking from a water fire hose, we're drinking from a power fire hose. And I think people have to really look at how that's going to affect their community. If you have a great tech center like San Francisco, I can't imagine what it's like. Like there's probably very few places that people are building any more data centers.
I mean, you can't even make phone calls in San Francisco because the network, the mobile phone network is so terrible in San Francisco. Palo Alto too. It's impossible. Like the infrastructure is so bad. Furthermore, so I grew up in Northern California, although as you always mistake me for growing up in Minnesota because I lived there for a decade.
I know.
But the infrastructure in California for the power grid is completely antiquated. And that's why SDG&E, I live in San Diego, or PG&E, they shut off the power when there's high winds because it's all above ground and it causes these wildfires. So that's for certain a limiting factor. I don't want to like totally change subjects, but the thing that is, I'm going to, I guess, the thing that is most interesting to me is Dario, the CEO of Anthropic, a company that is near and dear to my heart for their not just their great technology, but their mission to have responsible AI adoption. He put out a op-ed in the New York Times, and it's all about this super bill from Trump that has tucked in it that they want to prevent any regulation of AI for the next 10 years. And I am a technologist, and I think this made a ton of sense for the internet. This does not make sense for AI. This is preposterous idea. The 10 years in AI is like 200 years, or certainly 100 years of internet age. So to think that there's not going to be any regulation on AI is frightening and inappropriate. And he actually calls out, there was that headline that was kind of a mischaracterization of an AI system that they're shutting down for replacing it. There was ChatGPT had an example of this, and Anthropic did, where they were they were rolling out a new version after doing some testing, and the model like refused to shut itself down. And in this scenario, he cites in the New York Times op-ed is a kind of like misleading headline that came out earlier this week around an AI system that threatens to disclose to one of the AI engineer's wives that he's having an affair that was detected in his email. Did you see this?
I didn't see that example, but I saw the headline and I was like, yeah, I thought about it not wanting to be shut down, and then it blackmailing people. I've been seeing that everywhere.
Yeah. So it is an overstatement. Like and Dario goes into it in his op-ed, which I strongly recommend. It's New York Times. And it's just look for the op-ed from Dario, and it's don't let AI companies off the hook. And he's spot on. Like there is so much. AI models are they're incredibly good at manipulating human beings, subtly manipulating human beings to take specific actions or behaviors. We know this for a fact. There's been tons of research on this. Go to archive, just run some Google searches, or go talk to ChatGPT or Claude about it. It'll give you some third-party data on this one. And then furthermore, we know for a fact that it is possible to hide a hidden agenda inside of an AI model. So that means that some third party can train a model with a very specific agenda that then downstream through its manipulation of humans, subtly manipulating them, driving their behavior, can be manipulating them. And then what this basically means is that if we aren't thoughtful about our adoption of AI, we'd just basically become meat puppets to some AI system which has been designed by who knows.
Yeah, that's why I didn't like DeepSeek. I mean, not that I felt like it was overtly malicious. I just think like it was trained on data from China, which behind the Great Firewall of China. So they have a certain political agenda that is not nearly as, about freedom, and their government is not nearly as has quite a few human rights violations in the last couple of years. So even there's the overt, like people could do that, but it's also, you get out what you put in. So if you were training on, certain value system that's not consistent, or at least laissez-faire on other kinds of other parts of society and governments, it could be really dangerous. But I do have one comment on Dario, and I really like what he is the most masterful CEO of media relations I've ever seen. Like every week they're in the news about one of these big issues. And I'm not saying he's being just disingenuous, but he is definitely like, not only were they talking about the, that in his op-ed, but then their research put out the, wording for the next decade that artificial intelligence is going to replace a lot of desk jobs. And so, that's, it's true. It's going to have an impact. I don't know if the problem is, I don't know how much it'll be replace and how much it'll be shift. There was when we went from horses to cars, blacksmiths became machinists. I know that there's a huge shortage in labor in our country, and skilled labor. So think welders, think electricians. Try and get an HVAC person to come out in July. You know how bad. Or if you're up north in the middle of the winter, it's just there's shortages in a lot of these things, and they're not bad jobs.
I can't get any work done at my house in the mountains in Lake Arrowhead. It's like impossible. Like I've had so many people come out, they'll give me a bid, and then they just ghost me. So the two big highlights for us is obviously the data center space continues to be a very hot market that is just crushing in terms of its outsized growth. We know downstream there's going to be challenges around power, both on the grid side and then also in production. In spite of what some might say, we are not in an energy crisis. We have an energy surplus, but as it pertains to our grid, it's a problem. I do know that much. Then secondly, this idea that we are not going to regulate AI for 10 years is just irresponsible and inappropriate.
Yeah. Now that we covered, the latest and greatest in AI, let's have a conversation with John Willis and get a little history lesson on how we got here.
John, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure following you and your career over these last, 16 years or so that I've known who you are, and really wonderful getting to know you in North Carolina most recently. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background, where you came from?
Long story short, I think I kind of joke that when you get to my age, you round down. I think up until when you're about 35, 40, you round up. Like if you'd say, I've got 40 years of experience, and when you only have 36, but when you get past 40 years of experience, you start saying it's 40 years. So it's somewhere past north of 40 years. I won't bore everybody with that. I started out as an IBM mainframe assembler in 1980. And I was part of my computer club. We were like the only high school that actually had a mainframe computer. I think maybe in all of New York, but certainly on Long Island. So, but yeah, I just, been infrastructure and operations my whole career. And that sort of involves programming, it always has. And you have to know how to program. At the very least, part of managing infrastructure takes a fair amount of programming. Sometimes it's just shell scripts. Other times it's actually high-level languages. Or my original job was assembler. Anyway, long story short, I got into one of those the dog with the squirrel. Every time squirrel. So that works for me and against me. The for me is that I've been able to catch trends for the last 40 years. So I've ridden early adoption of distributed computing. Again, always coming from the operations infrastructure point. Like, how do you protect the brand? At the end of the day, when I read the retrospect of what I've been doing my whole career is, infrastructure and operations, we call it DevOps today or DevSecOps. It's protecting the brand. So that's been my sort of this Gen AI craziness. To get into cloud, another sort of transformation type technology was very early in cloud. And that's where I met Mark. We started a great friendship and a great technical collaboration over the years. But yeah, you were asking about how did I get into AI?
What was the thing that really propelled you to jump in and yeah.
This Mark Hinkle cat, man, he keeps getting in my way. Every time I think I want to do something cool, Mark Hinkle. No, what happened was, I think it was late 2019, 2020, not sure, Mark. I was hanging out in what we call Hinklandia. And he said, have you seen this thing? And he showed me this tool that was using a GPT-3 OpenAI API. At that point, it was a very closed system, and you only had to have access to the API. And I'm like, and I was just finishing my book about Dr. Deming. And I'm like, okay, let me see what this. So I asked a couple of questions, and it just starts spewing out a couple of paragraphs of unbelievably interesting stuff about Dr. Deming. And I just spent 2.5 years, really 10 years, researching the guy. And I'm like, man, this would be great. So I went back home and I started playing with it. And, the first chapter was great. Second chapter was okay. And the third chapter was like nonsense. Right. And I was like, okay. And I dug a little deeper into I didn't want to go out and get a master's degree in AI at that point. Because AI to me was ML ops. How do you help these people who are doing Monte Carlo simulations or predictions or all these sort of advanced computational things in insurance, but not really getting into models, just helping them manage the distribution of those models and, helping them be safe, again, protecting the brand. And but now I was forced to say, well, do I need to learn this stuff? So I learned enough about the probabilistic nature of it, kept my eye on it. GPT-3.5 comes out. I'm still yeah, maybe the second paragraph's a little better than it was last time, but the third paragraph's still terrible. Even ChatGPT was again, magic 8-ball really for me at this point, because I wanted it for research. To me, I like to write books, and not that I want to use these tools to write my books. I want to use these tools so it can like accelerate the research time. Deming book took 10 years of research on and off. I mean, my last book, which we'll talk about, literally I was able to get all the research I wanted in, about a year. It wasn't until somebody showed me the RAG implementation, retrieval augmentation generation, and that's when I realized I could get grounded truth out of these fantastic predictive models. And I went all in on RAG. And so one last thing, I know, want to hear your questions around this, but one of the things is I started working with RAG. In fact, I actually started working with MongoDB, trying to help be an evangelist for their vector database tool. And I got to go in these large clients, and I just saw cloud, everything, every mistake we've made over the last 40 years was happening all over again. I always say operations folks are like cicadas. We go to sleep, we wake up and like, what in the hell did y'all do now? And so I really started thinking really hard about less about like how much I needed to learn to use the tool. I needed to learn enough to be able to teach RAG, and now I'm into evaluations. And actually now you got me interested, Aaron, in confidential computing. Darn you. But what I know I didn't know enough to be able to have a conversation with a CIO. So I'm not full of crap. But my real goal now is to educate these enterprises to not make the shadow IT problems, these problems that I've been seeing for decades, where we think everything new is new. And fortunately, if you've been doing this long enough, everything new is old. Anyway, so that's where I'm at right now. I'm trying to divide the two, like learning as much as I can. I've been really crash coursing on confidential computing because at first I didn't think it was really. I was naive not to understand how important that is as a conversation for CIO.
I'm glad that you're excited about it as I am. I'm not sure that the CIO really cares that much about the confidential computing hardware as much as they care about the guarantees they get from deploying it, right? So I don't even talk about confidential computing. I just talk about confidential AI. Because when what happens when they hear the confidential computing is they'll go start doing research on it, and they'll go down a rabbit hole of hardware, and then they'll be like, wait, why do I care about this like low level hardware stuff and trusted execution environments? So instead, what I always position it around is like, hey, you have confidential data flowing through your RAG pipeline. How do you provide guarantees that ensure your data policies are intact and your data is kept private and sovereign? But getting back to you about your books, you have a new forthcoming book that we're super excited to be doing a book signing at the Confidential Computing Summit called The Rebels of Reason. It's due out on June 5th. It's about the heroes and mavericks of technology who've emerged as the true architects of our modern era in AI. Could you talk about this book? And obviously, I think it's pretty clear why now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
give us a little bit of background about it.
Yeah, I think if you add up all the books I've written, this was the 13th book I've written. Now 6 or 7 or more IBM Red books. So if you even know what that is, they were still writing. They were very collaborative and fun stuff. But then I got really lucky to get involved with Gene Kim early enough. I got early access to his famous book, The Phoenix Project. We had a discussion, him, Patrick DeBar, and myself, about, like people are going to read this novel, which the Phoenix Project is, and want to know how do you do it. So we started literally about halfway into him finishing the Phoenix Project, and another 5 years sort of after writing the DevOps Handbook, which is Humble as well. And so that was a collaborative, very technical. And then I did another project with Gene called the Beyond the Phoenix Project, which was it was a sort of audio only discussion of like, how did we get to DevOps? What were the features? And that's when I started my sort of quest for storytelling. Because what my biggest part of that book was about a guy named Dr. Deming. And Gene had said, he said, you should write a book about Dr. Deming. And I played with that idea for 10 years. And I finally, during the pandemic, I sat down. And long story short, I love how Michael Lewis tells a story. He embeds deep technical knowledge of a subject that you may not know about, or you know about it. And he tells it in a storytelling. So I did that with Dr. Deming. I spent, it was probably 10 years end to end, but all through the pandemic, I wrote a book. And it was, I model it as like, this is the kind of book that Michael Lewis, maybe not as good as Michael Lewis writes, but, or actually not as good as Michael Lewis writes, but still good. But how he tells stories and how he informs you on deeply technical stuff. And that was a blast. And then I just started thinking about all the things that were going on with AI, and I just felt there had to be great stories, and there were. It was, you go back to, you know, if you want to follow neural networks in anger, it starts in 1943 with a paper written by two guys, McCullough and Pitts, and then you walk all the way through. But you could also go back to like Ada Lovelace. Anyway, the I just found. The thing I love is this research of finding not only how to explain deeply technical stuff to people like my mother-in-law, but also the stories are just glorious. And the more I got into the story, I mean, the first thing you look at when you want to write a book about history is Hinton, LeCun, like the Godfathers, right? But then if you do that, you miss the glorious stories of like Dr. Fei Li. Without Dr. Fei Li, it's another 2 or 3 years before we get ChatGPT. Ada Lovelace is part of the story. Grace Hopper is part of I've read 25 books in my research on the history of AI. Not one of those books puts Grace Hopper right in the middle of AI. Because if somebody doesn't write a natural language, i.e. a compiler, before she wrote a compiler, the way people programmed were with bits and bytes. So the idea that literally she creates a language, a natural language, they didn't call it NLP, but a natural language expression to basically define how those bits and bytes work.
Well, start with a little bit of context about Grace Hopper. Like, what year was it? What was she doing? Tell us a little bit of the story.
Well, for Grace Hopper, she was part of the Navy, and some of the earliest Press Eckert and McCaughey, who actually, you got to be careful asking me these kind of questions, Aaron, because we can go on forever. But, people call the von Neumann architecture. And a lot of people are going to get mad at me, but von Neumann was a shyster. He was a zoot suit. I mean, brilliant man. But there were other people like Turing and Press Eckley and McCaughey who literally had built those systems, but they couldn't talk about it because they honored their top secret clearance. Von Neumann writes the original von Neumann paper and breaks all the rules and doesn't even give credit to anybody. Anyway, I mean, those are the beautiful stories I love finding. I found those kind of stories. Anyway, Grace Hopper goes to work for Press Eckert and McCaughey. So they're the first guys actually creating the real first, ENIAC, basically. So she's right in the middle of there where they're talking to all these guys that Turing's writing programs with bits and bytes. He writes a chess program where he doesn't even have a computer yet. Anyway, she's right in the middle of this. This is what, 1940s, I guess, ish. I'd have to go back. There's a lot of people, a lot of timelines in my book. But yeah, I mean, just go. And then Fei Li is, she creates ImageNet. So the famous AlexNet with, Hinton out of Toronto, where they sort of show that they can recognize, they move the needle 9 or 10 points in accuracy. The whole world wakes up. They actually get purchased by Google. Well, the only reason they were able to do that is Fei Li spent their whole career trying to build something called ImageNet that took words and images and put them together, and was incredibly creative. And so she's Hinton is a rebel, no doubt. But Fei Li is she's a brilliant mathematician who's every day is somebody's yelling at her why are you not working for Wall Street? Why at this university is making no money trying to build this insane thing that nobody's ever going to use? It turns out that ImageNet was the core of really everything that happened, going from about 2012 in the sort of last decade of computer vision.
So ImageNet gets acquired by Google.
Well, ImageNet doesn't, but what happens is ImageNet, they run a prize where basically Hinton and his students win they every year the percentage increase of recognizing images with unsupervised learning goes up like 1 or 2%. They show up with this AlexNet tool, which is all based on neural networks. And again, not taking away from Hinton, he's a brilliant man and deserves all the credit he gets. But like the only reason they were able to show that is she had building this exhaustive image net. Anyway, so they don't acquire Dr. Faith Haley, they acquire Hinton and his team um, to go to work, and that becomes Google Brain, and they start working with Jeff Dean. And again, there's fascinating stories there too. But again, I think there's these. I mean, my book isn't about the unsung women of AI, but I do think almost every book I've read, in most cases, they're like one sentence. A lot of cases, these women are not even mentioned as part of this sort of narrative. So I feel pretty proud that I did my homework.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm thrilled that we've got it at Summit, and you're going to be doing a book signing.
First signed copy, which it's kind of cool. I appreciate you guys helping me, promote it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I've read it, and I mean, other than the first sentence was amazing. I mean, it just grabs you from the start. But
What was the sentence that you hit? Because I was trying to think which sentence it was.
it was something about my friend Mark Hinkle told me about AI.
Oh yeah.
No,
Now I get it.
no. Honestly, what was interesting is this is one of these technologies that is a slow burn, right? Like we've had AI winners where people have like research in this area has dropped off significantly. And if you look back on the just impact it's had since ChatGPT went live in the last 2 or 3 years, it's amazing that there were so many ups and downs. What is the one, and you were just talking about the unsung hero, what do you think is the most surprising or piece of connective tissue from the early days of I guess it was the Dartmouth conference where they sort of coined our AI till today that people probably don't even realize, and it was like the understated discovery that we haven't heard about?
A good example is what they call neural symbolic networks. I've read a fair amount of books where they only focus on neural networks because neural networks are the hot thing, right? Everything, the GPT, the T in it is like the ultimate, brilliant implementation. The transformer architectures is like taking neural networks to the level that I don't think anybody in the history of AI ever dreamed could happen. And credit Google and mostly actually all the combined groups over there, Hassabas and Hinton and Jeff Dean. But so yeah, all right. So then but the thing is, there's two threads, to be grossly overstated. The two threads of AI is expert systems and neural networks, or sometimes called symbolic or subsymbolic. Symbolic being expert. Google did this thing where they were trying to create this thing called alpha geometry. This was about 1.5 years ago, right? And they realized the hammer nail problem. Like, not everything should be solved by a neural network. And the alpha geometry was a great example. And they actually use Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. There's just two types of way the brain thinks, and they actually credited him for how they thought it through. And what they did is they created a neural symbolic network. So for like symbols and stuff in geometry, they used like rule-based and expert systems, and then for the sort of explanation of the generative language and the things to explain complex ideas around geometry, they used the neural network. And I was just at a hackathon, which I think Opaque Systems sponsored, which was awesome. And this young kid came up with this system that was using Prolog. He was doing prompt analysis, really clever stuff. But he realized that, and I was like, dude, that's neural symbolic. He literally was breaking it up. There was his mind. He figured out and he knew the history of AI. So I think there's part of and by the way, if you listen to all the giants right now, the LeCun, the Hintons, they're all predicting that the GPT arc, there's going to be something else coming over the fence. And again, I would argue, and I think it's a solid argument, that in order to understand what are these things, these hybrid neurosymbolic things that are happening, what's coming next, I think you cannot be informed unless you know the history. But the thing, I just realized when I tell my story, there's so many human stories. Like AI should have been called cybernetics. John McCarthy sponsored the first Dartmouth session, didn't like Norbert Wiener, didn't want him to get credit. I mean, everybody now realized it should have been called cybernetics. Everybody agreed AI is a terrible term. Right? So there's, and I won't go in, but there's like lots of these human stories. And Mark, you've read them, right? And maybe the other lesson here is, we talk about AGI, but maybe the real message here is no matter what happens with AI, there's always going to be humans. And the fragility and the brilliance of humans will always have to be weighed. And humans will do stupid things, even though AI will be incredibly smart. But AI is useless if humans don't use it. So maybe the human stories, too, help us understand how we navigate the future. And I'm getting very meta, but I think, until you mention that, I think that's another thing. I think that we are humans and we make mistakes. We have petty decisions. The question of who's going to control AI, is that a real story, or is that something that was just, people being fear mongers? I don't know.
The role that you've been playing in advising enterprises around AI and doing consultation, what are some of the surprises or unexpected findings that you've seen?
No, this is a great question because early on, so one of the things I've been very fortunate is to be involved with Gene Kim, not just the, writing a couple of books with him, but then he runs a forum. We used to call it DevOps Enterprise Summit. Now it's called the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit, ETLS. One of the things what we do is, like in one half of the year, we all get together and we write research papers about whatever we think. We break out into groups. I get to meet incredible people and we work together on these papers. We've been doing this for 10 years. And then the other half of the year, we do a conference where some of those papers make it in, but it's always enterprise focused. And one of the phenomena I started seeing when I've been running internal hackathons for some of these large companies, Gen AI hackathons, that I noticed there was this phenomenon of CEOs hiring chief AI officers, and chief AI officers literally, hiring, brilliant like CMU and Stanford students and being completely isolated. And even to the extent that in some cases, and actually a lot of cases, the CEO is telling this chief AI officer, you know what, stay away from the CIO. They're going to slow you down. Stay away from this. I'm not making this up because this happened in cloud, by the way, too. Like literally being, not only are they purposely being siloed, like literally put in a different location, but literally in some cases, wink, wink, yeah, if you don't mind, kind of stay away from, don't put the CIO on your mailing list, or, and like, then we go back to like, what do I do? What do the people of my tribe do? We protect the brand. And I'd run into these organizations where I'd talk to the chief AI officer, and they'd explain this glorious stuff that these brilliant young people had built, and like really clever ideas. And I'd say, well, what are you using, like Kubernetes? Well, did you harden it? Like, what's that? Why would we have to? And then I'd ask this chief AI, like, let me ask you this question: have you reviewed any of this infrastructure? And this is like a workforce automation company, right? Like where like wrong answers will have high consequences, or breaches could be devastating, right? And I asked the chief AI officer, I said, have you reviewed any of this with the CISO? And it was like this look like, boy, I know I'm gonna have to answer this, and I know it's a terrible answer. In other words, like the answer was no. And I realized, okay, I know what I'm doing for the next 10 years, and so what you asked me, what I see is, and I'll make this simple. It's always not binary, but just for the simplicity of aggregating what I've been finding. Half the places I go into, it's the chief AI officer where they're already building infrastructure, and they're either by design or just the way it's structured, completely divorced from the CIO and the CISO and the infrastructure operations people.
How do so are they getting this into production? Are they getting these like AI
Yes,
applications into
yes, being
production?
forced by by Wall Street. I mean, it is we're going to write on like in August we're going to have the Wall Street report about how we have embraced AI. And by the way, you all have to get there because we can't change the Wall Street Journal, public marketing campaign we're doing, right?
I mean, is there any attention to the data that's being used? Because it's presumably internal intellectual property.
No, they don't even understand, Aaron. That's my point. Like we can get into like what all my thoughts are like. Okay, once I do get the attention, what are the things? And data obviously is a big part of. We agree, but I'm talking like they don't. They're not even like they're still thinking they can put down a plain vanilla Kubernetes. And why would I do anything else? I mean, in other words, they don't even know what they don't know. But the second kind one is where organizations who understood what they went through with cloud and they're smart enough to see the future is the past. And what they're doing is they're letting their infrastructure and operations people set up all of the entry points to AI. And so they're building gateway structure. So it is really sort of the DevOps and DevSecOps people. Now they're including these smart young, PhD students and master's degree AI kids. But at the same token, they're running the show. So like in those worlds, nobody gets access to any sort of inference engine, LLM, or without going through a language model LLM gateway that's hooked up with Okta, and basically it has all like in other words, it's the hourglass, and they're building the front end, and you can't. There is no possibility of using the corporate network to get to OpenAI or get to Anthropic or get to any of these and they're doing this, they're treating this like a DevOps problem. They're creating all their embeddings in Artifactory, and they're storing things. They're creating pipelines. They're doing digitally signed attestations, and those are the ones where I'm able to have interesting conversations about data. Because I can't even start that conversation if it's a chief AI officer and they've already been told don't get anybody to slow you down. And they're not even listening to how to harden the platform engineering structure. You're not going to have any, like you're going to get zero bandwidth to have a discussion about like classification of data.
An example that I've come across is a performance car manufacturer who's experimenting with language model based robotics on their assembly line. And they quickly realized that the manufacturer of the robotics assembly line, by virtue of them collecting the data exhaust from the assembly of their vehicles, in a matter of years has the potential to become a direct competitor, where they can manufacture precisely the same performance automobile and presumably sell it at a massive discount. So this is an example of like, oh, well, if you move fast and don't let things get in the way, you're moving fast to your own destruction. Like that your supply chain partners or your distribution partners, it used to be that the data exhaust that comes off of these interactions are just ephemeral noise. But now with AI, it's actually something that can be used to create a direct competitor.
Yeah, no, we've talked about this. I love the concept of exhaust because we can talk about how I like to do color code. Like blue is it's already public. Green is it isn't quite public, but the risk of the data. I would say if it's red data, then like probably don't let it get outside of your organization, right? And you point out there's this idea of yellow. I would argue that we've had exhaust problems that like even the early days of Chef and Puppet, right? There'd be this argument like, well, why can't I? What's the risk of running a SaaS infrastructure on Amazon that builds your sort of Apache and your web services and your We didn't call it exhaust back then, but like there were certain companies that like, no, I'm not going to use your SaaS-based company because somebody could probably figure out how I do business, maybe some secret source of how you do software delivery, or like you're really good by just looking at the exhaust patterns of the configuration management systems. So this has been a problem for a long time. You're right, it gets way worse with AI. And by the way, again, pre-AI, and I was asking you this the other day, last time I heard, Walmart and Target do not put any of their cloud computing on Amazon. And early days, why? They're just a cloud computing company. Well, they're no longer just a cloud computing company. And so, like, you're right. If I'm a car manufacturing, how many steps will it take to OpenAI to actually produce cars? Because they just hired the Apple guy to make devices. So you're exactly spot on.
Yeah, I mean, you would have everything about the material specifications, the steps of the assembly process, everything, and you could immediately replicate it. And the same is true for like any business that's at enterprise scale. The intellectual property that flies off in the form of data exhaust as a function of just doing RAG, just doing RAG with, maybe it's your GitHub repo and your Jira. And in fact, there's a customer of Opaque called Bloom Filter who does process mining. They're a really exciting, innovative young company that ingests companies' Jira and GitHub data and then uses language models to create insights and assess risk around epics and stories, etc. That they became a customer because their customers, who are large enterprises, and I don't know which ones are public, so I can't. I'll just be silent on it. But they're like big brand names. Their customers were correctly concerned about their intellectual property being analyzed by language models and the potential that they could leak intellectual property inadvertently. There's the inadvertent leaking, particularly, that becomes not just likely, but almost a near certainty, as you have these agentic systems that are interoperating with one another. There is no way to scale hierarchical access controls across these systems. So you have to have some kind of hardware back guarantee.
Well, and like this is kind of a goofy story, but it's worth telling, even though it'll steal a little bit of time. Back in the day, there was a guy. This is going to sound crazy, but I'm going to tie the knots together, and Mark will have fun on this one. There was somebody called DevOps Borat, right? And he went for like 2 years where nobody could figure out who he was. And he was funny. He seemed to know everybody, so we knew he went to conferences. He knew backdoor stories. And nobody, I mean, and there were people, it was capture the flag stuff where people were trying to figure out who he was. Because it was like, come on, like he must have been at re:Event, because I was in a group where that's the only, and nobody could figure it out. And one day, some guy, and I don't brush his name, but he actually is one of the guys who created the first white paper of cloud computing, so he figured out he's outed, put out who he was. And I knew a friend of mine who was his best friend, and I was like guys like Patrick, some of the top cyber people who've been trying to figure out, waste of time, but like figure out who is, and how did he, even though he's a brilliant guy, how did he figure it out? He did a consulting job at Twitter. And like in one of his access for his day job work, he was able to get to find out how it is. So it might not even be the corporation. In other words, you're manufacturing. If they're running their stuff through OpenAI, maybe, Jeff Bezos would tell Walmart and Target, like, there is no way we can see your data. But Walmart and Target, like, yeah, sure, buddy. But it doesn't even have to be Jeff Bezos. It could be somebody who has access privileges for a particular job. Like, so, yeah, I think this exhaust is like a brilliant thing to try to help people. It isn't just the red data.
Yeah, it's red and yellow for sure. By the way, the DevOps Borat, which I just ChatGPT'd him, it was a parody Twitter account that reached worldwide fame in 2010 to 2013, based on Sacha Baron Cohen's Borat character. And here's my favorite quote. In my country, deployment is when you throw server over wall of data center.
Yeah, no, he was. I actually figured out who he was because once I knew there was a couple of things through my friend and all that, I figured out like who he was, and we actually met and had a couple of drinks, um, but yeah, no, I mean, but I know for a fact the reason he eventually got outed, which was some guy who was really smart, was a consultant at Twitter.
It was an inside attack. Um, if you don't have some kind of verifiable guarantees that are hardware backed, which is the only way I know how to do this, you have the inside attack vector. You have a proliferation of outside attack vectors that are being accelerated and scaled to unimaginable degrees because of AI. And then just like as you start to see applications chain together through agentic interfaces across vendors, customers, and partners. It won't just be an agentic workflow for RAG. It'll be that gets chained through an MCP interface to a customer, to a partner, to a vendor. And how do you prevent that data exhaust?
You probably know this firsthand. I don't. If I start praising your product, it's not because you're paying me money or you're saying nice things about me, because I was tough on your technology at first.
You were like, I don't even know what this is about.
The point is, I think, all right, so it's opaque, or whether it's this kind of solution that's basically getting solved, is once I realized what this thing could be, an end to end, that solved a big problem for me to understand that you can do this at the compute level. You can this sort of more than just data at rest. And in our last discussion, I started seeing the vision of like, as we get into agentic processes, and now it's not just data in some linear process going from here to there and back, which is all, as we know, not a well-solved problem. Now it's like data just flying all over the place. We're talking now thousands of control points in MCP. Google, I happen to be a bigger fan of Google's A2A, which is a mesh-based implementation, because, MCP is sort of client server or sort of, for vertical, if you will. But either way, now we've got data flying like in a mesh-like scenario where it is, exponentially more complex for end-to-end data encryption. And again, like at first I was sort of sold on, okay, I can, in a trusted environment, then I can actually feel pretty secure that my data is going to end-to-end be encrypted. But now it's even more important in the agentic world. You've got data flowing from like Salesforce.com to
ServiceNow, to Workday,
to Joe's two squirrels in a wheel system that have to tell you how many times the wheel spins. I mean, like,
yeah, they'll go deep. They'll go stick their head down the rabbit hole of the hardware.
Yeah. But I mean, this is because the other thing, if we go back to the color code thing, like we skipped around the first part of the conversation, which is I tell my clients, the first thing I tell my clients is, are you accepting that you are getting probabilistic answers for this type of system? Oh no, absolutely not. Well, then you cannot use Gen AI for this. Because it is probabilistic. You can get a high confidence level. That's why I'm heavily into evaluation tools now. But they're like, the nature of this beast is non-deterministic. It's probabilistic. So the first choice you have to make, if it's a high consequence application or the answers have high consequence, the first decision point is, are you actually going to use this type of technology, this probabilistic, we'll just call them LLMs or generative AI? And if you are, and it is red data, or even yellow, as we discussed, then you cannot let it leave your four walls. Now, I think the exception is if you feel like you can rely on a trusted end-to-end environment. But at the end of the day, it's still that, like all these models, and somebody might be saying, well, John, don't they have you check the flag to say they don't train on your data? Nonsense. That data is going into their Kafka, their Redis, because by the way, their infrastructure is cloud native computing. It's Kafka, it's Redis, it's all the toys you have to do to build a highly scalable infrastructure. The icing on the cake is the AI. The last 10 or 5% of it is AI. The rest is common cloud native structure. And they ain't guarantee you that that data is not exposable.
So you were starting to go into, I think this is the one thing that people overlook is, okay, first you got to understand the data going out into the world, and then you've got to monitor, for lack of a better term, and that's the observability and the evaluation of how that data is being applied in the models. I think this is something that almost, outside of the cutting edge people don't understand. We just had Atten, who is the CTO from Galileo, in a previous episode, and he was sharing what they were doing. And I know it's your passion project for the year. Why don't you tell us a little bit about like what you should be looking for, how these tools are going to make you, monitor what's happening and help you make better decisions?
Like we talk about those two types of corporations. The corporations where the chief AI officer, and it really is the Wild West. There's Jupyter notebooks all over the place. Maybe they're smart enough to put it in GitHub projects, but it sort of ends there, right? Their chunking strategies or whatever they're using to change their unstructured data to vectorized data or CAG or RAG, graph RAG or whatever sort of argumentation generation. It's still everyone I've seen where the structure is not run by institutionalized infrastructure and operations people, normally we call them DevOps, but they have other terms, is just Wild West and like probably going to put you out of business. The other ones who are building like LLM gateways and they're buying. I had a large client that I did I did a 2-week workshop where we trained almost like 800 Java developers, and they were using Galileo, and the Galileo was basically it. The infrastructure operation people already. It's like when you're delivering software, a lot of people will mandate that SonarQube does checks test coverage, and then you have to attest that you've met this level of test coverage, right? That's standard DevOps 101, right? Well, in this new world, the people who've been building those type of architectures are looking at products like Galileo and saying, okay, I need you to sort of attest that for this type of application, you're showing particularly computational, and there's quantitative and qualitative. And I know I throw out a lot of big terms, but trust me, I had to learn them because I'm not that smart. So you can learn them pretty quick either. But there's qualitative and quantitative metrics that tools like Galileo and Arise, and there's there's actually a ton of open source tools that actually you can use as well. But Galileo is a good product, and they went ALA on this across the board. And now here again, to get into any AI system for any developer in this organization, large manufacturing company, you had to go through this gateway. The first thing you got to do is you got authorized by Okta. Then you were told you were given sort of examples of what type of models you were allowed to use, like could use OpenAI, could use Anthropic. And this was all decided by policy. And then the other thing is you had to use an evaluation tool. As part of you had to create there was a delivery pipeline, and it was built into the pipeline. So just like developers today don't just willy-nilly take software and put it in production, they have to put it in GitHub, they have to do a commit, they have to do a merge, there's a pull request, all this stuff, right? And then once you hit that pull request, right, lots of cool things happen. Well, in this case, things like Galileo are evaluating, and so what is the products like Galileo or evaluations do? They can evaluate computationally correctness, toxicity, bias, hallucinations, mathematically give you percentages. Like this particular evaluation of this data and these prompts measure out at 95% or higher correct. And now you baseline that every sort of change in the pipeline has to calibrate to that level, or the hallucinations have to be less than 2%. And this become your baseline, and this is the new break to build. And then what gets really more interesting is, I wrote a book with a bunch of people called the Investments Unlimited, which was about DevOps automated governance, where internal audit, if it's a high consequence business like a bank, where you make if you build an LLM, God forbid, that somehow gives another customer's account information, you are losing your banking license. I am guarantee you. I don't care if you're J.P. Morgan Chase. You might get a restricted business violation, what they call severe enforcement action, for maybe a year, but like that's like going out of business. And so you have to, if you're going to use, hopefully banks never get to the point where they're basically building inference on system of record knowledge, or like funds. But for whatever reason in this crazy, wacky world, they better have an attestable pipeline. Because, in a bank today, if you want to change any code that touches anything about funds, there are microscopes all over that software delivery process. Not saying it can't go wrong. And what an internal audit does is ensures that the second line and first line, they call it 3 lines of defense, all adhere to strict policy of a service that manipulates, changes, or displays data about a customer's funds, right? Or any kind of funds transactions. It's what we wrote the book about, the Investments Unlimited, about how you had to do that. Because if you don't, you'll have an organization called the OCC either giving you incredibly fines and possibly restricted business and even possibly a cease and desist. And it has happened. So the new audit is going to be, why did we get this answer? And how did you calibrate all the things that happened to get that answer? And a big part of that are going to be products like Galileo, and there are other tools or open source that can tell correctness, bias, toxicity. Again, a lawsuit for a racist comment, in some answer for a chatbot, right? That's going to be brand reputation problem and monetary fines.
Just a few days ago, so I think it was June 1st, I saw a Financial Times article about the big 4 accounting firms, PwC, KPMG, I think it was EY, Deloitte. I think those are the big 4. The audit industrial complex has moved incredibly swiftly to do enterprise AI audits. I don't know if you guys saw this, but it was just in Financial Times on June 1st. When you see all 4 of the big firms build a practice as quickly as they did, there's a massive amount of money that they see, a huge buckets of money. So the auditing, though, that you're referring to, they're obviously going to have some manual processes. They'll probably tech enable them to some extent. Galileo is a terrific product. They do auditing on quality of outputs, inputs. They do some protection around prompt injections. One of the things that you've mentioned is attestable or attested. And I'm not sure everybody understands what you mean by that. And I'm not certain that I do. Are you talking about hardware attested? Is that what we're like?
I'm right now, not necessarily, but that is part of the bigger picture. What I focus on is mostly about how do you deliver software, right? There's all forms of, but it's actually, there's more conversations in large corporations about hardware attestation.
Yeah.
But it's the same concept. It's like, for example, was there, and this is part of almost every governing body, like, Sarbanes-Oxley, any of the NIST regulations.
Attestation of the process through some regulatory.
Yeah, and like, for example,
some standard process.
Was there a review on the pull request or on the merge? Can you show a log that 2 different users went ahead and validated and looked at that? Those things actually, there's a famous Knight Capital, the company that lost $45 million in under an hour, is out of business, got a cease and desist in 24 hours. They couldn't show any attestation. They couldn't show any evidence. And in our world, we try to create immutable attestations, so they're not like ServiceNow records that say, I think Joe did this on Tuesday, go check the log, right? This is literally a digitally signed attestation that goes into immutable, SigStore being one of the more popular tools. But yeah, that's what we mean by attestation. And one thing I want to talk about, external and internal, again, I'm an expert in how to help you bolt down software delivery in pre-AI, and now I would even say in AI. I'm not an expert on all things audit. I know more about internal audit than I do external audit. But I think for an internal audit organization, you have two things you have to worry about. One, you have to worry about passing the external audit, and that's what the CEO wants to know about. And then some of those are driven by regulatory boards like banking or insurance, or so those are even more specific to the industry. But then internal audit is like, how do you protect your brand? So you got two jobs. What you don't want to have happen is the Air Canada story, right? Where the Air Canada gives out a wrong answer, and by my napkin man, a young man wants to go ahead and get a refund for going back to his mom's funeral. He asks the chatbot. It tells him, sure, go ahead and do it. Calls in, tries to get his refund, and they're like, nope. Turns out they used a rag. They had multiple conflicting information. One was system record. One was an FAQ. He happened to get the answer in the FAQ. They wound up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for like 2 weeks during the final lawsuit. The payout's $800, but my napkin master, they lose $500 million in market cap. That's not like the FAA is going to shut down your business because you gave the wrong answer. I mean, you may get a fine. That's how do I keep my company off the front page of the Wall Street Journal? And so again, there's two different worlds. I focus a lot on how do you protect your brand?
So what's the top piece of advice you give to enterprises working to build secure, reliable AI systems? I know that that's probably, let's boil it down to, if you can, hey, this is the number one and two things that I recommend.
Yeah, I think this is the answer you would give for kind of the same but somewhat different reasons. Is you got to understand the data, and the data classification. Even in the good hygiene companies, which are building LLM gateways and authenticating their users and creating the hourglass for usage and building specific prompt templates across the board, doing guardrails, doing evaluation, doing all these things. Even in those worlds, they're still not mature enough to say, they're turning a product like Galileo over to all their users and say, you can go figure out what Blue or Rogue or all these very complex computational metrics are. What I need to say is, you need to come up, just like we did cloud, is when somebody wants to write an AI application, they have to come to this group and they're going to explain, they're going to have a full out spec'd out definition, what the data is, what they're going to use for, how's it going to do it. And then we're going to tell them how that thing's supposed to work. And even if we're using something like Galileo, I don't want the developers to have to understand all the complex metrics. In other words, I don't want all my Java developers to go take a 2-year degree in AI to understand what all these complex metrics mean. I'm just going to tell them, send in your color code and we'll come back and tell you whether you did it right or not. In other words, so it's about focusing. It's the same thing we learned in the cloud. We told everybody to go out and use the cloud, or we had shadow IT. And then we realized all this data was showing up all over the place that was confidential, and we pulled it all back. And the first thing we did, and if I was going in to consult to a large corporation in cloud computing, one question I asked whether I knew I should be there or not, which was, do you have a data classification program? And if they said no, I was like, yeah, we're both wasting our time right now.
That's great. That's super helpful.
If you were going to go in today and said, not knowing anything about these organizations, what is the one piece of low-hanging fruit that pretty much almost any organization can take away from AI? Is it, coding? Is it, knowledge work? Is it processing your own data securely, as we just discovered? I mean, what's the big win if you were starting today?
I and this is sort of self-servicing, Mark, we run workshops together and we do work, and it's not because I run a RAG workshop. And I think this, RAG is dead is, there's some brilliant people I highly respect who say this. I think it's the initial inflection point or control point to understand what data means with AI. It teaches you everything you need to know about inference and cosine similar, all this like complex things that happen. And whether I think you're always going to need a RAG for something, but at the end of the day, I'm calling it XAG now because it's like all forms of like what they call CAG, or which is a cache burst, or this graph RAG. But I think the two things I think, and just that I'm the two things I'm focusing on this year in my workshops is RAG and evaluations, because they're the hourglass of getting data right. And even if it turns out the context windows are so large that you don't, that you have a bunch of scenarios where you don't need RAG, or traditional augmentation generation, then the idea that you went through that understanding of how data gets vectorized, what it means when it's embedded, and all those things. So I actually still think this over rotation of RAG is dead is harmful. I think that in the end, I think to me that's the hourglass. Like what I find is if I need to convert 3,000, I've been in environments where I'm helping them convert 5,000 Java developers, and I think the best gateway drug for them in AI is building a RAG, because it teaches you everything from temperature to chunking to how paragraphs look, how does the layering work. Again, it's the short course of how AI works.
So that's that's taking your traditional data and embedding it in a vector database, and then applying that data to the model without training or fine tuning. It's actually just supplying that data to give it context for your answers.
Right. But another point about that, a well-written RAG workshop, which again mine I think is you don't just stop it like loading into vector and then passing it off to the frontier model. You start understanding like the importance of data. So if the first question is data that tells the organization where the best place to go to lunch is, you vectorize it, you chunk it. In that case, you probably don't even vectorize. You just throw it in the context window. Because wrong answers or semi-wrong answers, all right, so it like that fish place was actually better than this one, but like how did you go wrong, right? But as you move up the data classification chain, RAG is a first step, but then there's a whole lot, starting from just vectorizing it, using similarity scores or semantics, computational semantic tools to get closer to the right answer. Then there's sort of re-ranking, which now you can sort of go through like another form of semantic embedding process. You can even, like in some cases in my workshop, and anybody who does a good workshop on this, like I might actually use a form of training the embedding with PyTorch. If that still doesn't get you to the efficacy that is required by the policy for the answer to these questions, then you got to train your own model. And I don't go that far. I point you in that direction. But I think that understanding the spectrum of data through a RAG, which includes advanced RAG techniques, all the way from re-ranking to things like, retraining the model with PyTorch, gives you way better footing, because most of your data is not, most organizations today, by my informal surveys, and everybody I talk to agree, most organizations in the generative AI world are not training their own models.
So, Aaron, if you were implementing this, I think I know the answer, but I want to be for sure. So, if John's right about RAG and that's the best low-hanging fruit, when you're using something like confidential computing, would that be a security measure so that if you don't have the great classification or misclassification, would confidential computing provide security as you apply that to the frontier models?
So yes, but it's properties made possible through confidential computing, not confidential computing itself.
Okay.
So I'll give you a for example.
Yeah.
And you could read about this at Opaque, or Meta has private processing for WhatsApp. You can read their white paper. Just Google Meta private processing. It'll be the top search result. What properties confidential computing makes possible is for each one of the resources as part of a RAG pipeline, you can create verifiable attestation that's signed by the hardware. So let's say it's an agent that's doing data ingestion for that vector database. How do you know that that is an agent that is communicating over an encrypted channel and processing the data encrypted, that has specific policies bound in the runtime that are cryptographically enforced? You would have a trusted execution environment, a test, and sign that. And then before you interoperate with that agent, you would verify that attestation meets your requirements in your registry. And then you say, oh, okay, cool. That agent works for doing the data ingestion. And then similarly for each chain within that confidential agent workflow for that RAG pipeline, because it'll probably be broken up into multiple agents. There'll be an orchestrator, there'll be some guardrails, there'll be an ingestion agent, there'll be et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those resources, the channels, the Kubernetes node, would be verified through an attestation process as meeting your minimum requirements. And then during the actual runtime processing, as I mentioned, the data would have policies bound and provided by the data owner. So if you can federate and distribute the policies to the data owner. So each one of those data owners with the data source would hold the encryption key on the data and permit a connection to the data source that have explicitly defined policies. Now, those policies could be inherited from a catalog somewhere, but the point is that they aren't like just trust me policies. They're cryptographically bound as part of the runtime and enforced on data that's being processed in the runtime while encrypted. But there's one final stage. After the processing, there's an immutable audit trail that's created. And it's immutable not just because we say it is, but because it's signed by the hardware where the runtime processed everything. So then in that way, any third party can take the signature and the audit trail and verify the policies, data privacy, data sovereignty across that that agentic. It's like a kind of. I mean, I think of it as an agentic chain, right? That's generally how you implement these RAG. And by the way, like on the RAG is dead, whatever you call it, there's data being ingested and organized in it. Like sometimes we have customers that are using agents to write SQL, NoSQL, and Python API calls on the fly and calling against these attested communication channels to back office systems. So they're not even vectorizing the data. They're taking the credentials of the user who wrote the prompt. The user holds the encryption key on their prompt, so they can't actually see what the user wrote. And then it's being passed through a series of agents that are ingestion agents calling against different back office systems to pull in data.
So, Aaron, like just to put the final bullet on that, right? Like, I mean, I think we talked about this. Like, I mean, again, I'll make up a scenario that I don't know that is true or isn't true, but like in the military, right, we have data that like I don't want to give any exhaust. Like, I don't want internal. I don't want somebody, being able to, like, I want to make it incredibly hard for you to get at data because there's a lot of ways I can inject, like, tracing and things like that, the data that's encrypted in all the different processes, right? If it's red data, and red data in the military is pretty clear, right? Top secret, cleared. But like, I don't think there'll ever be a day where the formula for Coca-Cola is being spun around in a LLM. But like formulas like that in a corporation, that's red. Right. And like, even if it's within my four walls and they're never leaving, I don't want an internal bad actor basically having, I don't want to make their job incredibly hard, maybe even possible.
We've discussed there's yellow data, which is metadata about the parts in your manufacturing chain for the Coca-Cola recipe that in and of itself you would never be worried about. But with an LLM, you could just look at the metadata and say, oh, the formula for Coca-Cola is very obviously, because I just ran it through an LLM and 2 seconds later it spit out exactly the formulation for Coca-Cola. But look, we're grateful to have you. You mentioned a workshop. We're particularly excited about you and Mark hosting a workshop at the Confidential Computing Summit on June 16th and doing a book signing. The workshop also has Aten from Galileo, the founder CTO. There's Joe from Crew AI, who's the founder CEO. There's folks from LangChain. There's folks from IBM. And the workshop you guys are hosting is on the new normal stack. We got to wrap it up here because I know we've taken too much of your time, but tell us, what is the acronym normal stand for?
Yeah. We didn't get to that. I think Mark was going to punch me in the nose if we didn't do that. I was thinking. Remember, it's earlier. I was playing with this stuff. I was starting to get pulled into clients to help them understand the hackathons, and I'm watching this like what I was calling a technical debt tsunami. Like way worse than any technical debt. And I started thinking like, okay, how do I explain to the people who don't know what this stuff all is? And I started thinking about the lamp stack and how effective the concept of the lamp stack was explaining the sprawl of like web services and all that. And I started playing around with like, is there a stack here? And it was clear there was, right? You had LLMs, you had orchestration in the form of evaluations, you had RAG or augmented generation, you had model management, and then you had agents. So I originally came up with this thing called Lormer. Mark helped me out a little bit, said that's a terrible acronym. Came up with normal. So normal is it's N ways, unlike LAMP, where it's sort of like PHP, MySQL, Linux. Like every layer could have like multiple, orchestration could be Galileo or the O of normal could be Galileo, could be Arise, it could be Langsmith, it could be Langfuse. I mean, you go down the list, right? The R could be, RAG, it could be CAG, it could be any type of augmented generation. And again, another area that like there's not a lot of products, but like if you're using embeddings, where are you keeping those embeddings? Because if you can reverse engineer embeddings, I can reverse engineer your model. And by the way, I want to know from an audit perspective what exact embedding you used to get this answer. So those things need to be, you can't just be having these embedding models laying around all over. Oh, I think we used the one from Huggy Face on June 7th. Like, that's not going to be an acceptable answer when the OCC wants to take away your banking license. And then, model management, and then the A is agentic, right? All this sort of like understanding how we are contextualized, how we're doing agents, what they're going to look like from a GitHub, from observability, all those things. And then L, which probably should be the first one, which is making sure that you're building a gateway architecture and how are you managing multiple LLMs, because you will not just have one LLM. You'll have small language models, you'll have foundational, frontier, and you'll have your own homegrown ones. And so that's really normal, represents literally a sort of a spectrum to get your head around. Can we have a discussion if we use this on how we might manage this mess we might build if we're not thinking this way?
Great. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, it was great. Great conversation, y'all.
It was interesting to hear his takeaways from the history, but I am not a data geek, and hearing you guys geek out about data exhaust and red data, blue data, I honestly thought I was pretty well versed on like data governance, but I feel like even people that are well versed have no idea the extent of like how this data, before it was sitting at rest. 90% of our data is unstructured and 60% of that we only use once. So it just sits there. But now we have like these, agentic AI that can go out and, take action on that data. And I think the attack surface is bigger. I listening to you two go back and forth was very educational for me, because I realized what a data novice I am.
I don't think there's that much to it. Like people will often come up with very elaborate systems of data classification that involve massive consulting projects to analyze all of your data. You have to do your data inventory, and then you have to categorize it by, medallion status or color status or sensitive, confidential, public status. Everybody has this vast silos of data lakes and warehouses. And the idea that you're going to go in and inventory and categorize all that data is preposterous. Rather, what you do is be more intentional about when you go to use the data as part of an agentic system, you define the policies and the connection. If you focus at that level, it's like a whitelist of entities or data sets that you can use rather than trying to categorize it all, because you'll never categorize it all. It's a fool's errand.
That's what I'm trying to get my head wrapped around. Like, I've just connected my Google Drive to ChatGPT and Claude, and it's great. But then you read like Dario, we were talking earlier about Dario's large language models blackmailing engineers. I'm like, I don't think I've said anything in there, but even
that Phyllis would object to.
Yeah. I'm like, well, she probably would. She probably just ignores it now. But I mean, you could really do some psychological warfare on someone even if they didn't have any, scandalous stuff in their email. You could really manipulate people from that data if that was the, intent or the model. But I'm just thinking that you're right. I guess, be the gatekeeper, don't be the indexer is the way to think about that.
The topic that we discussed with John about data exhaust, organizations are just waking up to this right now. And this is, like I discussed with him, the use of large language models to deeply understand a business's intellectual property from metadata is unprecedented. So the Coca-Cola example is a really good one. I'm glad that John brought that up, because if I were able to use an agentic system analyzing just the supply chain of Coca-Cola, a large language model would be able to tell me the Coca-Cola recipe. Now, maybe for Coca-Cola, that's not that relevant, but for any other enterprise scale business, it certainly is. All right. If you want to learn more about how to use AI responsibly, check out our website at opaque.co. Obviously, you should be subscribing to all of Mark Hinkle's newsletters, including AI Tangle. If you like the podcast, please subscribe wherever you get fine podcasts. This episode of AI Confidential was produced by Wolverton Media Solutions, Places Media, Kodiak's Media, the AIE.net, and Opaque. Music was provided by my buddy Matt Malamuka. I'm Aaron Fulkerson.
And I'm Mark Hinkle, publisher of The Artificially Intelligent Enterprise. Remember, if your AI is hallucinating, that's a problem. If your boss is hallucinating about what AI can do, that's your next gig. Thanks, everyone, and have a good week.
Pew, 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 pew. Pew, 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 pew. My latest domain purchase was LMNOP Ultra. Because LMNOP is my favorite part of the alphabet. It's also right in the middle. I also have LMNOP Anon. It's left of QAnon.
Okay.
Red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather. I want to hear you try that.
I can't do it. I got a lisp. I came from Pennsylvania.
That's why I'm the CEO.
Oh my God.